Okay,
You never.
I am now recording. So good afternoon, everybody. It is Sunday, February 21st, 2021. I'm Keir Murray, and I'm joined by political scientist Richard Murray and my dad. Hi, Dad. How are you this afternoon?
No, but
Just
it's
fine.
It has been an extraordinary week, to say the least. And I want to, at the outset, offer apologies for folks who were expecting a podcast several days ago. We had fully intended to deliver one, but neither of us had electricity at the appointed time. So I think some folks were informed of that, but if you weren't and came on here and wondered why there was nothing happening, that's why. And I'm sorry for that. But it was sort
Tell us how
of
you are.
unsolvable circumstances in the moment for us. As I was just saying before I started recording, normally we like to take a broad national look at the political scene and sort of move more state and local as we progress through the conversation. But I think, given the extraordinary circumstances of the last week, I'd like to invert that. Um, as all Texans now are painfully aware, uh, around this time last week was the beginning of a deep freeze in the state of Texas. A lot of winter precipitation across the state, including here in Houston, but much more north of here. Frigidly cold temperatures, which caused widespread power outages that, as I mentioned, Dad and I both endured, as I imagine many of the attendees experienced. And coupling those power failures were water system failures,
Sorry.
including here in the city of Houston, where Mayor Turner just in the last 10 minutes or so lifted the boil water notice.
Oh,
So
yay.
you're going to go get a glass of water out of your fridge. I think you're in the clear to do that now. But really, in the modern age where uh, reliable electricity and water service are things that most Texans and Americans take for granted, we lost those things to some degree, at least for most people, for as long as several days. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about what that might mean politically for the state. But Dad, I'd just like at the outset to kind of get your take on what happened over the last week and what you think it
Flush your water
means
system by
from a
running
public
cold
policy
water
and political
faucets for at least
standpoint.
1 minute. They can discharge
We need to ask everyone to make sure they are muted. We're getting some background noise. I'm not technically prepared to dive in and talk about the causes of this. A lot of people will be working on that in the next days and weeks, but I'm more interested in the political fallout. Nationally, the last half century, we've seen a lot of leading politicians done in by weather events that they were judged to have responded poorly to. It's, in politics, it's usually not very rewarding to make a lot of investment in against a potential future problem. First, they're extremely difficult to predict. The problem may be A, not B or C, and the things that don't happen, you get no credit for, and it usually is somewhat costly to invest in these sort of hedges against future events. But when they do happen and they're on your watch, you got a playbook that says get out in front of the story, take responsibility, show you're engaged. If you fail to do that, it often is terrifically damaging to your political career. Here in Texas, of course, our state's been run by Republicans since top to bottom since 1998, and the governor's office and most statewide positions since 1994. So this is a problem for the leadership in our state, which happens to be entirely Republican. And my take is if you grade the most important person in this respect, it's at some risk, Governor Abbott. I think he gets a D+ at best.
Yeah, Governor Abbott is by most accounts the most popular statewide Republican elected official in Texas. He's consistently polled better than most everyone else. But I think some would argue, he's for the most part been governor up until a year or so ago at a pretty prosperous time for the state. Not that there haven't been certain problems, but overall things in Texas have gone reasonably well. But beginning with the pandemic a year or so ago and his handling of that and the accompanying economic crisis, and now with this latest power disaster, I mean, I watched one of his news conferences a couple of days ago, And it was the first time in his 6+ years in the governor's office, seen real urgency on his face, not manufactured urgency, but very businesslike, to the point. This is what we're doing. No flowery language about, explaining the problem or the solution. Just that these are the things that are happening, and these are the things that we're going to do. And it was unusual. I mean, I think I told you I was a resident of California 20 years ago when the state began experiencing these rolling blackouts, and which did end Governor Gray Davis, ended his political career soon after and ushered in the governorship of Arnold Schwarzenegger for the state. But, Davis was somebody who had been talked about on the short list for vice presidential ticket, that sort of thing, prior to this happening, and it destroyed his career. And so I agree with you. I do think the governor is at some risk, particularly given the way that Texas has its own electric grid that's overseen by an agency called ERCOT, which is overseen by the PUC, which the governor appoints, right? So it's indirectly goes back to him, and he's going to have, I think, a lot to answer for in that regard. Of course, additionally, I don't think we could let the subject go without talking about another statewide elected official, our junior United States Senator Ted Cruz, a Houston resident, who caught a lot of flack for zipping out of town to Cancun, Mexico with his family in the middle of this crisis, and hightailed it back, I think, less than 24 hours later, and is scrambling to do damage control now. But not that the U.S. Senator from a governance standpoint has so much of a direct role in managing this crisis, but I just think the optics of someone in a leadership position like that abandoning the state, and by the way, someone who fancies himself a contender for president, to just skip town in the middle of a really unprecedented crisis in the state's history. What do you think about Cruz and how this has reflected upon him?
Well, he's fortunate he's not on the ballot next fall. He didn't win by much last time when there were no scandals particularly associated with him. But he's not up until 2024. So he may politically recover here in Texas and hold his Senate seat. But I think any realistic track to the presidency is gone. I see no way that he can be a viable candidate for the Republican nomination. And if he were somehow successful in that, I think Democrats would be incredibly delighted that he's the guy they can run against across the entire country. So, he might regain enough political footing to survive as a senator, which he's never been a hell of a lot interested in. From where I said, Cornyn is kind of the guy that you go to in Washington if you want something done for Texas. But, he's, I think, politically, I'd stick a fork in his presidential ambitions.
Yeah, and just lastly on that front, I think it's been interesting to see a lot of criticism levied at Republicans statewide and other officials, relatively little action on their part, and then I think sort of showed up at the same time by folks like Beto O'Rourke, who's a former elected official but now a private citizen, and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who flew into town yesterday with $3.5 million she raised in a day for relief for folks affected by this crisis, and was at the Houston Food Bank and other places with local members of Congress. And both O'Rourke and Ocasio-Cortez deserve credit for helping folks, but I thought it was also an interesting contrast to watch their behavior versus sort of the Republican ruling class in the state, which was largely relegated to just tweeting or doing media interviews, as opposed to sort of on the ground, roll up your sleeves and get things done for folks. I don't know how much that contrast will matter long term, but I think some people noticed.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting reactions I saw was one of the most prominent Texas Tea Party folks, a lady based in Tarrant County, absolutely blasting the governor for rolling over for the big industrial consumers and leaving ordinary people, which is most Tea Partiers are, out in the cold, literally, without water. Brought to my mind the old bumper sticker of 1981. It was very popular in Texas that said, "Let the bastards freeze in the dark." Well, bastards were Yankees. The bastards this time around were Texans. and they noticed.
Yeah, and I think, it affected folks regardless of economic well-being, right? I mean, you had people in their $1.5 million homes sitting in the cold and dark, as well as folks in a one-bedroom apartment. So, I mean, this crisis, in some ways, like COVID, although there is more of a socioeconomic strata there, but it found everybody in the state, which I think makes it harder to deflect blame for if you're Governor Abbott or other officials.
Yeah, this is something people aren't going to forget very easily. The combination of, losing power, being like Mrs. Prue said, we're freezing in her River Oaks home. And then the terrible problems we've had with water. So I think this has legs. It will be a problem through at least the next election cycle. And Governor Abbott is up for election in 2022. And I think he's virtually assured now of having a fight within the Republican Party. That some of the more critical folks, not all of whom are Tea Partiers, but are Republicans, very likely now will support an alternative candidate. And, the governor has a huge war chest, but I think his popularity has taken a real hit here this year, and particularly in the last 10 days. So even before we get to the Democratic opponent in November next year, he's got a fight within his own party. So I'll be interested in seeing how he performs here in the next 100+ days of the current legislative session.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I mean, the legislature is really just getting going in terms of its conducting its business. It's been slowed down, of course, by COVID and the some outbreaks at the Capitol and trying to mitigate those circumstances, but they really haven't done much yet. Committees in the House were just announced a week or two ago, and very little has been done. The new speaker, Dade Phelan from Beaumont, not surprisingly, called for emergency hearings next week on sort of a lot of Texas grid and its reliability or lack thereof, and what the legislature might do about it. This is not the first time the state has had this problem. I don't think it was quite as severe as it is this time, but 10 years ago, in 2011, there was a similar weather-driven event that resulted in a lot of power outages around the state. And at that time, Mayor Turner here has said, he was then a member of the Texas House, filed a bill to sort of mandate contingency reliability for electricity, but that bill never got a hearing. And so I guess what I mean to say by all this is we're going to see hearings and a lot of posturing by the legislature, but my question is, what do we think they'll actually do about this? If, as has been noted, to weatherize these plants, gas and coal and others, nuclear, is a costly undertaking for rare weather events like hard freezes in the state of Texas. We have a lot more problems with heat and with flooding and things like that, but not as much with cold weather. So will that expense be mandated, and who will pay it? My guess is if they mandate it, ratepayers are going to pay it. They'll just pass the cost on to the consumer. How long does that take to get done? And, some have suggested that the state, which is on its own electric grid, should get with everybody else. And I don't see that happening politically. But what do you think they'll do much, or do you think they'll make a lot of noise and do the minimum?
I think they'll do something. And yes, the ratepayers will end up getting stuck, but remember, the biggest ratepayers are industry. Texas has a lot of heavy industry that's an enormous consumer of electricity. And according to a email response I saw from a Reuters reporter who's covered energy issues for years, they've basically been driving the show since deregulation. And their logic is simple. They want to make a profit, and they're not interested in paying significantly more for electricity to provide reliability or excess capacity. And that's basically they've been calling the tune. But think about other players coming in now. I saw some estimate that perhaps the insurance industry will take a $50 billion hit. Well, they may have some lobbyists in Austin this time around too, who say, we can't have this again. We've got to build in this reliability because we can't have 3 million homeowners, that are filing very significant claims. So I think it'll be a very interesting session. The big power consumers industry are going to have a lot of other folks at the that are piping up instead of operating below the radar, where usually they've gotten their way.
And you mentioned insurance, and then the question that comes to mind is, what, if any, role will the federal government play through FEMA or otherwise in making folks whole in terms of costs for repairs from things like ruptured pipes and other damage that they may have suffered to their homes. We saw that President Biden has been in touch with Governor Abbott, made an initial disaster declaration in about 75 or 80 counties, and I think is waiting on further information from other counties to probably expand that. But he's very publicly and quickly committed to helping Texas get through this however he can, and may, if it's not disruptive, he says, come to the state sometime later this week to survey damage and see what can be done. And Governor Abbott and some of the Republican leadership have seemed a little more accepting of federal government help than perhaps under the previous Democratic president. I'm wondering if you think that the severity of this crisis kind of resets a tone for Texas Republicans and how they interact with a Democratic president and congressional majorities in Washington.
Good question. The Texas Republicans feasted for 8 years on the Obama presidency and paid no political price for it. He was a convenient target. The base loved it. Biden is not as disliked, of course, even among conservatives and Republicans. And his political instincts, I think, are very good. That a crisis is an opportunity. Obama, in part, was saved for re-election by the Hurricane Storm Sandy. It hit the Northeast at a critical moment a few days before the election. He quickly reached out to Governor Christie, who had presidential ambitions himself. They became a kind of team. Obama won re-election. A lot of people, including Mitt Romney, thought that was not going to happen. So Biden is an old pro. I think he understands that in a crisis, you don't try to blame anybody down at the state level. You reach out and emphasize, we're all part of the United States. And every now and then, that's a good thing. As my old state of Louisiana found out after Katrina, a relatively poor state like Louisiana could not possibly have rebuilt any kind of reliable system that would restore New Orleans without massive federal help. And we're not as poor, of course, as Louisiana. But every now and then it's a good idea to find out we're part of the union, that it's kind of the world's biggest insurance company with access not only to tax dollars, but also a unique ability to essentially create a lot of money.
Yeah. And, since we sort of transitioned to Biden, let's talk a little bit about what's going on with the new administration. We're about a month in. The COVID vaccination program has picked up steam. Looks like it's poised to pick up more steam. As viewers will recall, I think Biden projected he wanted to get 100 million people vaccinated in the first 100 days. Looks like they're on track to exceed that. So we're reading an AP story earlier today that they now want to set the bar higher and try to get most American adults vaccinated by the end of the summer. That we're up to about 1.7 million, I think, vaccine doses a day being administered. I think the goal is to get that up to about 3 million per day, if possible. And a lot of this is that they've been setting up the infrastructure through pharmacies and other existing entities. And the federal government is going to, I think, stand up at least 100 or so sort of super vaccine sites around the country, including some here in Texas, I understand, and to really try to speed up the vaccine process. How do you think that sort of critically important aspect of the new administration getting on the ground is going so far?
I think very well. Biden has made it quite clear he's going to stay focused on the big stuff. That's trying to get this virus under control, and that will then enable us to rebuild the economy. Of course, he's got this huge package that has worked its way through pretty much the House now, and is expected to hit the Senate quickly. They're aiming to pass this $1.9 trillion program by the 14th of March, when the latest round of unemployment benefits are scheduled to end. what we know from extensive polling is this is very popular, overwhelmingly with Democrats and independents, but even a very substantial number of Republicans. So Republicans have been pretty hobbled in trying to build a reaction against this, very much in contrast, say, to the big proposal for healthcare reform that Obama was pushing 12 years ago. So Republican criticism of the package is, hasn't gotten any traction really, and they mostly focus on reopening, the slowness of reopening the schools, which some blame for that can be laid at the door of the Biden presidency. He is beholding more than most presidents to teacher unions. But if you get the virus more or less under control, / with vaccines being administered, the schools will be open by the summer. And that's probably means it can't be much of an issue going forward. It's not, it's not been a particularly helpful, but right now Biden's had some luck that, the vaccines worked better than we expected, and manufacturing is gearing up. The Republicans are divided and haven't found a way of blocking this $1.9 trillion program, which will be very popular, I think, because a lot of folks will get direct benefit from it. And, the Democrats need all the help they can get looking at the midterm elections coming up with the thinnest of majorities in both the Senate and the House.
Sure. Yeah. And my understanding is the COVID relief bill, I think, goes to the budget committee tomorrow in the House, will be marked up and probably voted out of there and get to the floor probably late this week. And then we'll obviously move over to the Senate side. There's some bones of contention, I think, even with some Democrats. For example, the provision about raising the minimum wage to $15. It's unclear if that's going to make it into the final package or not. But one of the things, of course, that's important about this piece of legislation is that they've moved it under what's called budget reconciliation in the Senate, which you're allowed to do once a year, and I think, and means that you only need a bare majority in the Senate to pass it, rather than the filibuster-proof 60 votes that seems to me would be nearly impossible to attain on virtually anything at this point in time. So, and I agree with you. I think there's been sort of window dressing opposition. I saw Steve Scalise from the House, a Republican leadership from Louisiana, put a statement, saying members should vote against this bill, but it's pretty muted criticism based on what we've seen in the past, for example, around the Affordable Care Act. So, and my premise is that if you're a Republican in a marginal House district or a marginal Senate state, voting against this bill may not be in your political interest. Seems to me that any Democratic opponent you would have would hang that around your neck next fall in election. So I agree with you. Democrats have a lot of political risks going into the midterms, but Republicans are not immune from those risks either. And especially with something like this COVID bill, which has, I think, about 70% approval with the American public. So it'll be interesting to see how many, if any, Republican votes end up going either in the House and or the Senate for this legislation once it hits the floor.
It is. And again, very different scenario than we had back in the Obama administration, where virtually all Republicans united in vigorously opposing the Affordable Care Act, in part because the base also was opposed. Maybe some have since softened, but that's not the case with the COVID crisis and the relief package. And we saw in Georgia, as two Republicans were struggling to hold their Senate seats, they came out strongly in favor of the $2,000 checks. It didn't save them, but they knew from their own polling that they were dead ducks if they didn't get behind this proposal. So, voters are much less ideological generally than political leadership are these days. I mean, they're concerned about what's happening in their personal lives. And this COVID thing has been a huge disruptor across the spectrum, schools, people having to give up their jobs to take care of other folks, jobs going away. And that's what people are caring about. They don't care about the ideological cultural war issues in these circumstances. Notice that interesting silence of Dan Patrick here in Austin, normally our foremost cultural warrior in the legislature, but he's laying low. No bathroom bills coming this year.
Well, maybe his tongue's frozen from sitting in the dark earlier this week. um, so I want to get to the events of a week ago in a minute. It seems like a year ago, but first, former President Trump looks like he's going to make his reemergence on the political stage this week with a speech he's scheduled to give at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee convention or forum that's held, I guess, every year. Some are, anticipating what he may or may not say. In addition, he put out a statement early last week, sort of blistering Mitch McConnell, the now minority leader in the Senate, for his ineptness and failed political leadership, and clearly setting up this battle for control of the Republican Party. McConnell, after voting to acquit the president in the impeachment trial, which we'll talk about in a minute, then afterwards immediately got up and gave a speech excoriating Trump for his behavior and suggesting that he can and will be criminally charged for what he did. So how do you think this dynamic is setting up for, how Republicans move forward in the post-Trump as president, still a political figure era?
Well, I think often the term civil war is overused, but I think that's what we've got now within the Republican Party. That a lot of the leadership, even though they won't say so publicly, have been extremely personally dismayed by Trump and his behavior. That, of course, was reinforced by the losing control, especially of the Senate. And a lot of that responsibility goes on Donald Trump for what happened in Georgia. And they have on their side the donor class. The traditionally, the more wealthy financial and other interests have helped Republicans. And they're pretty much off the president. But of course, the president has 75% support among the Republican base. So you have this huge gap again that we first really noticed back in 2009 with the Tea Party, between rank and file grassroots Republicans, particularly their activist core that now dominate a lot of the state party structures, and the traditional party establishment based in Washington, supported by players like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that, they're not going to get a divorce, but this is a very troubled marriage within the party.
Yeah, and of course, I read a poll earlier today that said basically half of Republicans are ready to leave the Republican Party and go with Trump if he, for example, as was rumored for a while, decides to create his own party, the Patriot Party, I think is what he was going to call it. Who knows if that'll happen or not, but interesting to note. And I do agree that the establishment Republicans have that big donor base, but Donald Trump has a fundraising base too, a small dollar fundraising base, which he, used to great effect during the post-election period when he was contesting the validity and honesty of the election, and raised tens of millions of dollars from these folks, and ostensibly he would continue to have the ability to do that. So he's not without resources either. Perhaps he lacks an easy platform on social media these days, which hurts, but is not necessarily something that can't be rectified. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, who wins that fight? Between the McConnell establishment wing and the Trump wing. I mean, who do we think wins?
Well, it'll be interesting to see in the primary season next year, particularly in these deep red states like South Dakota, can Senator Thune survive? I mean, Trump has already indicated, I'm going to get somebody in to run against you. So the first round will be the battles in the primaries across the country. And, in a lot of states, I think the rush is going to be who can be the most loyal to Trump. And that may not help you in the general election, but it may get you through the primary season. And clearly there are going to be some targets, the people that have been outspoken. I guess this, 5 or 6 term congressman from Illinois, who's a, very attractive individual, well-spoken, but is catching holy hell. He's got a moderate district, as I understand. It's the affluent Chicago suburbs, but the Trump people are out to get him. And half his family has disowned him, according to a story in the New York Times. So lots of interesting action. Meantime, the usually more fractious Democrats, because they have such a far more diverse set of party identifiers, have been pretty unified. Partly, I think, because they have such narrow majorities in Congress. My old colleague Bruce Oppenheimer, what we call a Congress jock in political science, said in some ways large majorities are destructive of the congressional party because people fire off in their own directions. Well, when you got only an 8 or 9 vote margin in the House and 1 vote in the Senate with the vice president, you can't afford much of this. And so Democrats have been normally, again, the more difficult party to hold together, but they've been pretty unified because they stare at the abyss. That if they have significant defections, their whole legislative program falls apart.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think in some ways the two things: the severity of the COVID crisis and what it, from both a public health standpoint and an economic standpoint, is felt across the country, and makes it easier for members to stay focused on fixing that, because that's what they're probably hearing back in their districts from constituents about, and it's just a massive problem that has to be addressed. And I think the other thing I would say for sort of rank and file Democrats is that there's so much relief to have moved on from the Trump era that I think there's a lot of patience right now with Biden and to some extent the Democratic Congress for just getting normalcy restored in their eyes and pursuing sort of basically popular measures, because it's just such a contrast to what they'd experienced over the past several years.
Yeah, I would agree.
Well, even though it's only been a week, we did have an impeachment trial last weekend that concluded last weekend. As everyone knows, former President Trump was acquitted in the U.S. Senate, but there were 57 votes to convict him. 67, I think, were needed to do so. But it was a fascinating trial to watch. House manager team led by Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin, I thought, had a pretty impressive group of folks prosecuting the case. I was less impressed with the president's legal team, former president's legal team. He had a hard time getting folks to work for him, lawyers to work for him on this, and it showed, I thought, but it didn't matter much. What's your read of how the impeachment process played out and where it left things politically?
Well, I think it was a good process for the Biden administration. It went fast, partly because they were not interested in dragging it out. They opposed calling witnesses, for example, to wrap the trial up. They were able to keep the legislative express moving forward. Again, they've got not a drop dead date, but an important date of getting this $1.9 trillion program done by mid-March. The hearings, important ones, particularly for Merrick Garland, that process continued to go forward. I guess he will have his first and perhaps only hearing in the Senate on Monday. And you got so many parts of the government, particularly the Justice Department, that it just have to be substantially rebuilt. So it seems to me that the trial reinforced how this thing ain't over by any means. That the assault on the Capitol, the fallout for individuals that are going to be tried or plead out, and for the president. You mentioned Mitch McConnell basically saying, you got real legal responsibility here, but it should be pursued outside of the impeachment process, given that he was a former president. So as we've noted, or I've noted a number of times, Trump is a great machine for voter turnout and for lawyers. Lots more stuff going to happen legally. Some of it none of us knows yet, but there are these processes underway, particularly in Atlanta, over voting issues and the president's interference, his business dealings in New York State, a bunch of trials coming of people that were directly involved in the insurrection, many of whom apparently are going to say Trump told us to do it. So it will be, this extraordinarily interesting show will go on just without Trump tweeting as president of the United States.
Yeah, and I mean, I was struck during the entire trial, like thinking about how different it might have been if Trump had been on Twitter, sort of giving a blow by blow every day of expressing outrage over this or satisfaction over that, depending on whatever was happening. Um, it it has reduced his ability to be in the mix in terms of media coverage and things like that, which may explain why he's decided to get out and make a speech next week. I noted he called in, I think, to a Fox program last week to talk about the passing of his friend Rush Limbaugh, the conservative media guy who passed away several days ago. But I think, contrary to what they might publicly say, I think he misses the limelight. I mean, he's a guy who fed off of that in his career as a business person and as a television media person for years before he ever got into politics. It's got to be hard for someone like him to not have that spotlight on him all the time.
Yeah, people that have been in Washington in administrations talk about how dramatically different it is where you walk out of a limo and get in a yellow cab. And Trump doesn't have to take yellow cabs, but he doesn't get the extraordinary amount of media coverage, which all of his life has been a narcotic for him as a non-drug user. The media sort of is substituted for alcohol and other chemical substances. And now there's just much less of it. And he's got the additional problem of having his lawyers saying, be careful, be very careful. You've got a lot of other things coming. So, the Trump story continues, but we're in a very different chapter.
And so lastly, I just want to shift a little bit back to Texas. We saw, I think about early last week, that the U.S. Census has indicated that delivery of data for the 2020 census can be delayed further. And I don't think we're going to get it until late September, if I'm not mistaken, which will complicate the map drawing process, to which you have some involvement here in Texas and other places. As most folks know, the regular legislative session ends June 1st. Here, pretty clearly, we won't have anything by then. There are probably going to have to be special sessions called for other things anyway during the summer, but this suggests that they're going to have to come back in the fall and do this. Texas is scheduled to have a primary in March of 2022. There's already been a bill filed in Austin by a Republican House member to allow the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker to delay that primary as late as July 1st of next year. How do you see the whole redistricting process unfolding in Texas, and how that may affect the election schedule and who files and runs for what next year? Seems to me some folks are going to have to make some pretty quick decisions later part of this year.
Disclosure, I have been employed by some of the congressional and legislative members on the Democratic side, particularly African-American members. So, my comment should be judged in light of, I have a dog in this fight, as I've had in previous redistricting sessions. Obviously, this round, 2021, maybe goes into 2022, Republicans have some huge advantages. The Supreme Court killed effective pre-clearance for Texas and a bunch of other states, so you don't have to run stuff by the Justice Department. After the fact, you can be sued for violating what's left of the Voting Rights Act. Republicans control the governorship, both houses, and if it goes to a redistricting board, they'll have all the members of that board. So there are some huge structural advantages. But as someone that's spent a half century working in this stuff, and I know a bit about it, approaching it from different sides. I've worked for governments. I've worked for Republicans here in the local area on certain deals. This is going to be a real challenge for the Republicans. Just looking at the population data, what we're going to find when we eventually get the stuff is that 85% of the growth in Texas has happened in this urban triangle that's Dallas, Fort Worth down to Houston and over to Austin, San Antonio. Those are the areas where Trump has most damaged the Republican Party. So we've seen a huge number of voters that in 2011 were reliably Republican, like our neighbors next door in West University, that you can't count on anymore. Democrats aren't out of the woods either. They saw a significant drop in their support among Hispanic voters along the border, but also in Houston and Dallas-Fort Worth. So there's an awful lot of uncertainty out there in drawing these maps. If you go for a maximum map, and there's going to be huge pressure from Washington in the congressional redraw, because Republicans think they've got a shot at recapturing control of the House, you can really get wiped out, because none of us knows the circumstance of the election in November 2022. I think that has to happen at that date, whatever the primaries are. And, do the Latino voters continue to drift away from the Democrats? But what about these upscale, highly educated Republicans that used to be very strongly supportive? The Asian vote's becoming more important, and it's been shifting more Democratic. So redistricting Texas, even if you're in total control of the formal process, which Republicans are, is going to be a lot more complicated. Just to take one final point. In redistricting, if you control the process and you're weak with a particular group of voters, you do this combination of what's called packing and cracking. You pack as many of those voters as you possibly can into one district, like Dallas-Fort Worth. Eddie Bernice Johnson was the only Democratic member. She had just about every minority voter you could find. But Texas minority populations that lean Democratic are dispersing. They're no longer so concentrated. So packing them together is very hard, because you don't find very many precincts anymore that are 95% Black. And because they're more dispersed, cracking becomes harder as well. How to figure out these districts that you can win, but maybe with only 55% of the vote. Well, that's an unsafe margin. Things go wrong, you lose the seats. So redistricting is going to be delayed, as it was in 2011. We didn't get a primary until May that year, not March. And the runoff that I think that Ted Cruz won was, I think, at the end of July. So we're probably looking at that kind of shift of dates. We may have to relax the filing deadlines, which are quite early in Texas, December of this year. That may be pushed into early 2022. But with all the other stuff that's going on, that also is going to complicate redistricting, in my judgment. Even if you separate it out, voters are looking to the legislature to do a bunch of stuff. And that's got to be first and foremost on a lot of individual members' docket. If they don't please the voters back home, they could not be coming back.
Yeah, and I follow a lot of Republican members of the Texas legislature and Congress, and just watching their tone on social media, beginning after January 6th, but really accelerated in the last few days. They're much less talking about a lot of the sort of ideological red meat for their base that I usually see for them, and a lot more about practical, helping people kind of stuff. And that suggests that they have good political antenna, right? They wouldn't be elected otherwise. That they sense the challenge and the risk here to some regard, to some degree at least. Okay, with that, I'm going to look here. It looks like we may have a question or two. Okay, a writer for The Atlantic said on CNN that the aggregate number of votes for all public offices in the U.S. over the last 10 years has been 45% Republican and 55% Democrat, yet Republicans hold more than 60% of public offices. This was attributed to gerrymandering and voter suppression. Do you agree with his numbers? And second, do you agree with the assessment that gerrymandering and voter suppression are responsible?
Well, what a big factor is the combination of the Senate, which overrepresents smaller rural states like the two Dakotas that have 4 senators and a total of 1.5 million people, a third of the population of Harris County. Some of those small states, of course, like Delaware, are Democratic, but more are Republican. So there's a built-in bias both in the elections to the U.S. Senate and because the electoral votes also reflect, the fact that every state gets 2 electors automatically because of their Senate representation. So the Electoral College is a bit tilted too, and that's not a gerrymander, that's just the Constitution. But certainly in 2011, when Republicans had control of about 7 or 8 big states that were politically competitive, they did a marvelous job of gerrymandering. Now, the gerrymander didn't work at the end of the session. A couple of states changed their rules, like Pennsylvania. And in Texas, they lost a couple of the seats that were safe when they were drawn in 2011, including the 7th district here in Houston. But because of population and political shifts, were no longer viable. So some of it is gerrymandering. Voter suppression, I take a somewhat contrarian view. Yes, you've had obviously documented efforts by Republicans across the country, Georgia, Texas, to try to make it more difficult to vote, and that's had some success. But it also opens up the lane for people like Stacey Abrams, who are out there saying they're trying to keep you from voting and raising a lot of money. And, you know, she sort of won that Georgia battle. The Battle of Atlanta was won not by just Sherman in 1864, but by Stacey Abrams. She got a lot of people registered, and, you know, they beat the party that controlled the state apparatus. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Vote suppression, it has its downsides. It's not as if the other guys don't notice what's happening, and can often rally people behind. They're trying to keep you from voting. It's important that you vote.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, actually. I mean, I stipulate that there are efforts by the Republicans to stop people from voting that have done some real damage. But, you know, as we saw 3 months ago, we had absolutely record participation in the U.S. election. And even in a place like Texas, one of the lower voting states in the country, we had dramatically higher voting than we normally see. But that doesn't necessarily benefit one party or the other.
Yeah.
We had a big increase in turnout, but basically it was a wash in Texas. I mean, the composition of the congressional delegation didn't change. In the Texas House, you know, each side lost and gained 1 seat, so that was a wash. And, you know, mostly things stayed about the same. So I do think gerrymandering is important in terms of drawing congressional seats for sure, but I'm not so sure about the voter suppression writ large. What would be required for Texas to assure an equitable and accessible voting system, in your judgment?
Well, we don't have initiative, so you can't, as you could in some states, get rid of the gerrymander by legislatures by, you know, a petition that changes you over to a nonpartisan commission. That's what happened in California, to a lesser degree in Florida. So that avenue is not open. So that means you have to elect governors and legislators that will change the rules or apply them more fairly. And, you know, so that's the courts. Clearly, the Supreme Court has ruled definitively they're not interested in challenges based on partisan gerrymandering. If you are blatantly going after protected minorities under the Voting Rights Act, they might intervene, but largely the federal courts have punted. Now, in a number of states, you've been able to find clauses in the state constitution that have enabled you to challenge very unfair maps. So far, nobody's gone very far in that regard in Texas, and of course, the Texas Supreme Court is 9 elected Republicans, so maybe that's not a great venue. But essentially, elections have consequences. As Texas becomes a more competitive state, you know, the ballot box is your best avenue.
Yeah. Lastly, was a question about the news programs this morning talking about federal funds possibly being able to use to pay for some of these exorbitant utility bills that folks who were in a variable rate plan in Texas got, several $1,000s in some cases for a couple of days. Is that a viable solution for the feds to come in? I mean, I saw Mayor Turner was on saying basically the state of Texas should pick up the tab, and even the Republican leadership in the state has said this is unacceptable for folks to get these kind of bills and that they shouldn't have to pay them. Do you think federal money, or do you think that's just something the state will just have to fork it over?
Well, for a state political establishment that spent 2.5 decades trashing the feds for intervening, all of a sudden, they look like a more attractive dance partner for the next few months. I'm not sure how widespread these enormous bills are. That's a big factor. I don't know. We have all kinds of options for consumers for different plans. Some of them are fixed and some not. If it's a widespread problem, then you got to do something because all the House members are up and all the senators in Austin are up. For senators to have 4-year terms, but after the redistricting, everybody has to run. So you got 181 members and the lieutenant governor and the governor that are all on the ballot. And, some of them didn't win by much. And we have probably 40 of the 180 legislative seats are quite close. So if people are getting an earful, and if somebody gets a $5,000 electric bill, they ain't going to sit on it and they're not going to pay it probably. So let's see how widespread. But if these exorbitant charges are widespread, they'll have to be somehow lessening that. People can't pay a $5,000 electric bill if you're an ordinary working class family.
Right. And, just for example, I saw also the state is temporarily waiving the license requirement for out-of-state plumbers, so that we can get more plumbers in from other places to help the thousands of people that need repairs done on their tens of thousands probably who need repairs done on their homes. And it's yet another mess we have to clean up here in Houston and in the state of Texas. It seems like we've had a lot of those over the last several years.
One of the things that, why there is in a functional democracy where the government isn't stacking the deck and to hold power, that there's turnover. Because invariably the party gets control and runs things, some things go wrong. And so we talk about a change election, and every now and then that's what happens. And that was a big factor in Trump winning in 2016. 8 years of Obama and the Democrats, and a lot of voters were ready for a change. There's no reason Texans are exempt from that. So the Republican hegemony that's lasted for a quarter century is increasingly at risk. And part of it is if you're the long-standing party, grievances accumulate. And some of the party's strength among, say, the booming energy sector, that's fading. So I look for more interesting times.
Yeah, and when you're the only party in charge, you start fighting among yourselves. If you don't have an enemy that can beat you that's outside the tent, you start fighting within it. It's human nature, and have increasingly seen that be the case in Texas. The last thing I'll say is that I think the events over the last several years, but really culminating with what happened this week, I wonder if it's put a dent in the sort of myth of the Texas miracle, right? Which is that we're a low tax, low cost state, lots of jobs, lots of economic growth. Everything's wonderful. Every business should want to come here. Every professional should want to move here. But that, that sort of climate has its own downside. And I think we've seen in pretty stark terms, especially with what happened this week, the possible fallout from that, having that kind of a regime running your state.
Well, the only law of human behavior I subscribe to is the law of unintended consequences. So, you enact a policy like let's have cheap electricity with deregulation, but that to get cheap electricity means you don't build in excess capacity, you don't winterize your system, and then it comes back every 10 years or so and really bites you in the butt.
Yeah. Well, will be interesting to see how state government in particular moves forward in trying to address the immediate challenges, but more broadly, I think creating more confidence among the public and, this long-term resiliency. But with that, I think we'll leave it for this week, and let's hope it's a calm one. I don't know exactly when we will reconvene, but, sometime in the next 3 or 4 weeks is my guess. We're going to do these periodically, but not every week, I don't think. But thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
So is this going to be up on YouTube?
Yes, I will post it to YouTube and send Debbie the link later today.
Okay, good.
Thanks, everybody.